Hey all, grab your favorite beverage and welcome around the fire as we chat with people who make a difference using technology for organizations and people across the globe. My name is Luke Murray, a Microsoft Azure MVP, Senior Consultant for Datacom in New Zealand. And today we're going to talk about compliance and Azure Policy and how Bevan Sinclair, technology specialist at Microsoft New Zealand, does a lot behind the scenes to make sure that New Zealand organizations are equipped with the tools they need to audit their environment for regulatory compliance using capabilities like Azure Policy. So, Bevan, did you want to introduce yourself for the audience before we dive in?
Luke, thanks for having me. My name is Bevan Sinclair, and I'm an Azure technology specialist based in Wellington, New Zealand. I specialise in the public sector and working with our government agencies and trying to help them get the most out of their Azure capacity that they are trying to leverage to get more access to services for the citizen New Zealander. And so I do a lot of work across the public sector, including education and health in New Zealand, to sort of work on some of these services to help them provide a better response or work across the entire sector, helping agencies learn from each other and leverage the central capabilities provided by our Internal Affairs Department and some of the areas of that dictate how they should be using technology. So I get across the landscape in the public sector.
And it's quite a critical moment for New Zealand with the New Zealand North region as well sometime this year.
Yeah, that's going to be amazing. So one of the biggest challenges around government adopting public cloud, there's always discussions around things like residency and latency and security. And so being able to ameliorate at least two of those, because security is an ongoing discussion around not just a security of the technology, but also the organizational security as well. But being able to ameliorate both latency to other countries and also the residency of the data being held in our nation helps reduce the issues or the bar that agencies have to get over to get access to public cloud services. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. So let's dig into sort of my first question. So you go to the Azure portal, you go, I want to make sure my environment aligns to industry standards. You see these words like NIST and, Azure like standard benchmarks, security benchmarks, but New Zealand has its own set of sort of compliance requirements as well. Can you explain about the NZISM and how it relates to deploying and consuming resources in Azure for New Zealand?
Yeah, for sure. So regulatory compliance is something that Microsoft's worked really hard on because we recognise that beyond just having some wonderful widgets and awesome technology to play with, we're responsible for, as agencies, they're responsible for New Zealand data. And so they have to put the right controls in place to protect that information from different threat vectors. And whether they are, and there's different ways that data can be attacked from different actors. And so the NZISM is basically a set of controls and technology configurations that are designed to help agencies configure their environment to be secure. And that's the whole thing. It's around a configuration of your technology for the information that you store on it. So if you classify your information at a certain level, there's a certain level of technology security you need to apply. And the challenge with that, and with all regulatory compliances that we've had in the Azure environment, is that a lot of those regulatory compliance standards were defined or have been defined over 25, 30 years ago. Alongside the birth of, technology itself, it's also, been focused on a lot of that very specific configuration of on-premise technology. And so trying to read the intent of those regulatory compliance standards and apply it to public cloud has been really challenging. And so what Microsoft does is, within many of the countries around the world that have these standards, and you'll see them in our particular list of frameworks that we support, we work with the people who write the regulatory compliance standards to translate those into Azure policy initiatives. And so what that means is that customers who are using Azure in a particular country, if they have a set of compliance standards they need to adhere to, so for instance PCI DSS, you mentioned the NIST framework and CIS benchmarks and things like that, they might have that as part of their overall IT strategy that they need to comply, or their IT operating standard that they need to comply with those standards. So we make it as easy as possible to produce a set of initiatives that they can deploy directly into their Azure environment and get that compliance information straight away. And that allows them to then, either as they develop new services to be deployed, measure themselves against that standard, or retrofit previously deployed environments to meet that standard after the fact.
Okay. Yep. Sorry about that. I just disconnected.
It's all good.
Gotta love technology. So one of the things that really want to question you on today is about your contribution to the Azure policy initiatives for NZISM. So this regulatory compliance has, a set of the guidelines that they want, but how do you map those requirements from a white paper and then turn them into definitions that actually people can map and audit their environment against from a technical lens? It must be a bit of work, right?
Yeah, it is. So we publish we aim to publish a couple of updates a year. We don't always achieve that, depending on the length of time it takes to sort of work through it, or it can be interrupted by other potentially other work that's going on. And so the minimum we do is at least one update a year. And this means that the NZISM, which tends to have a similar sort of update flow, at least one per year, they sometimes do 2 or 3, depending on technology changes or reaction to changes in technology. Yep. It means that as we go through that, we're always working with the sort of trying to keep in touch with the NZISM. So what we do, a lot of it is work that I do personally with the GCSB and the certifying agencies. And so I work with people who work in those departments to understand the intent of certain settings within the NZISM around information that's classified at a particular level and translate those into Azure policy. Now, what I don't do is I don't write a custom policy for every single control, because I would be there until next 20 years trying to write a custom. So you rely on the built-in policies. So that's the first thing, to sort of reduce the scope. And to be honest, most of those frameworks that we publish as regulatory compliance or as a compliance benchmark against, say, CIS or NIST, they all use built-in as well. So our policy team internally at Microsoft forever updating and creating new policies that can be used by customers to form their own list of controls. We use those to build our regulatory compliance ones as well. So that's the first step, is to actually, and that takes quite a bit of time. It usually takes a bit of back and forth, because first thing we have to do is understand which policies are relevant and which ones are not, compared to the new list that's come out of new policies, which ones we need to deprecate because the technology has changed, or perhaps the NZISM has changed. And so there's a lot of list comparing going on. And then beyond that, we sort of have a general discussion about the technology and the intent of the NZISM. That tends to be a lot of the where a lot of thinking goes into it, because a lot of the time the thinking is based on previous examples of that technology. And so, for things like encryption is a really good example. You can get very specific standards that say you must use this type of cipher, or you must use this particular type of encryption methodology. Those are really easy because they're real black and white as around this is the standard which we must adhere to. Yeah. But when it comes to open networks and it comes to understanding multi-tenant applications or how data is treated, those things start becoming a little bit more of a grey area, because we struggle to sort of find an exact line item that says you must do it this way. And so what happens there is we look at the intent and then we apply that to the policy and say, yes, this policy makes sense, so we'll add that in. Or this one doesn't really have the same intent as the NZISM, so we're going to leave that out. So there's a lot of that work goes on.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to me, like listening to you speak. One is utilizing the policies that are already built in, so you're almost like eating your own dog food, I think, because when I think of that, I think of Defender for Cloud and being able to set up your own like regulatory standards according to your own environment based on inbuilt policies. So it's really good. Like you're going through the same thing, because a lot of us just go into the Azure portal, see a list of these massive initiatives, and then deploy them, but without realizing sort of how they're built and other things like that. But I think when you're looking at these compliance papers and then doing your audit, as you touched on, there's a whole lot of the three ways, like people, process, and technology. All the Azure policies are doing is really auditing against what can be audited from a technical level, but there's a whole people process that still needs to be adhered to outside of this, right?
Correct. Yeah. So the first, 7 sections, I think, of the NZISM are more about the people. You won't find, or it might be 6, that you won't find a setting, and there's not a policy that applies to any of those, because it's more about how do you treat your, the capabilities of your staff, how do you, what are the functions of a CISO, all of that kind of stuff. It's more about the people and the way that they work with the technology and the processes the business has, exactly like you said. So yeah, it's definitely only one part of a 3-piece puzzle, and that talks about compliance as a thing as well. One of the issues I see is that people use the NZISM initiative as an enforcement, and it's something I always say, never do that. It is a compliance standard that you measure yourself against, and it's not. You should never be 100% green, because if you are, you're probably doing something wrong, and that's my opinion, but it tends to be borne out in the fact that there are always nuances, and like you said, around the way that people and technology work, and also the way data is classified and the way environments are accessed. There's always nuances that say that whilst you may want, or the NZISM says you should have this configured in this way, and the policy initiative has that listed, you have an objection to that because a service doesn't work the way you think it should, or it doesn't support that particular encryption technology, or it is doing a job that doesn't require that kind of classification. And so you can have exemptions to that, along the way. And so that's a real key part of taking the standard and applying it to your environment, is to understand that it's not an enforcement tool. It's all about measuring your compliance against the standard, finding the gaps, understanding what they are, and saying, we don't need to worry about that, or we accept the risk of that because of these reasons, or we need to remediate that.
Yeah, there's always a healthy balance between like security and innovation, right? It's definitely a push and a pull, and I think informed decisions are probably the like.
It's really difficult for agencies, especially like a lot of agencies have a lot of legacy tech. And so the legacy tech doesn't support modern ways of defending yourself against particular styles of attack. And so you have to treat those sort of as they're really hard to protect when you're trying to also do the new cool stuff, right? And so you have to balance that. But there is also, you cannot also live in a state of fear whereby you refuse to move forward because you can't. You have to accept at some point there will be an element of risk and move forward. Otherwise, you'll never move at all. That's a real common challenge, is to sort of, and I'm not advocating, charge on without any thought.
She'll be right.
She'll be right. We'll fix it in post. Yeah, it is certainly not that. But there is a balance to be struck. And I come across both. I come across agencies that are so stuck in building the perfect environment that is 100% robust against every single attack and vector and everything like that, that they lose sight of the fact that the reason they're building is this, that someone has this need right now. And it's like, it's going to take you 2 years or it could never happen, because that's a nirvana state, right? The perfect environment. And so you have to accept that there'll be an element of risk while you get on the horse and start riding it. Or, there's the whole analogy of building the plane while you're flying it. There is an element of that with technology, especially with public cloud, and that you have to upskill your teams, and you have to change your processes, and your CNA process has to adapt to be more robust but flexible at the same time, to be able to change with the change of technology. That's really hard for agencies to adopt.
Yeah. I think we could go off the rails with this so much, but I think you touched on a bit of the well-architected framework and anti-patterns or trade-offs, right? Where you have to know what's acceptable risk for your organization, and then but also allow testing, and it can take minutes and hours to stand up these resources in Azure as an example, but you kind of want to test it, make sure it's doing what you want it to do without spending all this time, like you said, getting everything documented. I'm just making up words. Yep. But you know what I mean. It's like the level of sort of agility is there where it may not have been there. That's a better word for it.
Yeah, agility.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's 100% right. The agility is the thing that lacks a lot of the time.
So let's go back to the policy authoring sort of experience that you have. So you've got your white papers, you've got your list of policy definitions that you think might align. How do you go about testing those before they're released, or what methodology do you use there?
So that's actually quite a complex sort of answer because it is one of those things. Like, I do rely on the fact that a lot of these policies, and this is why I don't write custom ones, are already in the field. So one of the things we don't do is we don't use preview policies, because they are not tested. We certainly eye them up for future inclusion, but we never include them because they might introduce a problem whereby we are perhaps that is unproven yet, or or that we haven't foreseen because it's in preview. So that's one thing we do to sort of reduce the testing requirement. The other thing is that we have a bunch of there are a series of agencies out there who are my guinea pigs, so to speak. And so they have a process by which they can introduce the initiative into test environments and make sure that it isn't going to introduce a problem. And so internally, we test the policy that it works. It has to be, because we release it as part of our Azure code base. It actually gets pumped, goes through that process. So there's a lot of code hygiene process that it's going through. So just to be frank, I'm going through that right now, and I have a series of emails on my screen over here. They're all about that code hygiene process, that I have to remediate some of my JSON because I've introduced a couple of errors. But we go through all that hygiene, and then once it's released, we give, and the agencies who have tested it give me a thumbs up, then we release it to the Azure code base properly. So there is a bit of resilience testing going on there.
That's good, and continuous improvement as well, which is always a good thing, right? You can always take the feedback back.
Yeah, we build a lot of that into our dev chain. So our code chain actually does probably 98% of the checking for us. And so my interactions, that I was pointing at my other screen there, they're actually with the GitHub engine, and also the code checking engines that are telling me that I'm doing things wrong. So it's not very often that I'm actually talking to an actual dev back at the back end, except at the very end of the process. So automation's probably the big, one of the biggest, forklifts for that whole process.
And I'll touch on it almost. This is one thing I like that Microsoft does so well, is open sourcing and revealing a lot of this stuff publicly. So like you've got your community policy repo as well, where people can go and commit and update and add their own policies in. And, I'm sure there's the Azure Policy repo as well, where if people have issues, they can raise them and let Microsoft know that, like, there's these things that in the field that may not align to what's on paper.
That is a really interesting. It's interesting being on the other side of the fence from that. So having worked in a consulting business for many years, and in some of our larger organisations in my previous roles, it's been sort of, that wall used to be very solid, whereby if you had a problem, then it was fired it off to Microsoft, and I heard nothing about it, and I'm not even sure it's fixed anymore. That really changed about 10 years ago with Satya coming on board and being more open about sharing information, and it's evolved over time as well. And we realise that the strength that can give us, because it gives us millions of developers who can identify problems that we potentially would never see otherwise. And so that feedback process is hugely important to the way that we operate.
Yeah, it allows organizations like Microsoft to be able to deliver faster, more secure products, but also allowing the community to contribute in ways that make them, or make us, actually understand. It's the same with the Microsoft Learn documentation, right? You might open up a Microsoft doc about, I don't know, API management, and you might be halfway through reading that article and something just doesn't make sense. Like you touched on back in the day, it would have been maybe a support ticket through to Microsoft. Can you fix this? But now the community can go, oh, let me write this in a way that makes a bit more sense to me, add some images, and then, do your own pull request, and then that gets analyzed and reviewed by the Microsoft product teams and documents. And if all approved, you're now an author or a co-author of that.
And
So we're
that's
in charge of
massively
our own
powerful.
destiny.
Yeah, it's great.
So how do you stay up with the changes in the regulatory standards? Like you kind of said, there's 3 or 4 potential iterations of the NZISM a year. Like, do you go to their website and do you have a look at new versions? Is there other ways that you kind of maintain this?
Yeah, so lots of different channels. So, and this is one of the good things about the way that the one thing I like about the way that Microsoft works with government. So yes, the website, absolutely. Whenever there's a new version release, I do have people that I talk to inside those organisations that are responsible for it, so that I'm usually included before it gets released, so I can see the upcoming changes, especially when there's new sections that are introduced to deal with new technology. So if we think about the last version, there was a big section in 22, 23, sections 22 and 23, which were introduced around public cloud. And this was the first real major shift away from trying to define stuff as a technology widget and turn this on and turn this off, and start talking about guardrails and guidelines around things you need to start thinking about. So that will get developed over time, but that was super important because it sort of helps mould the way that we think about the NZISM as a whole, and start separating certain sections out into, like, if you've got an on-prem world, then this is more applicable to that, and it doesn't really apply to the public cloud world, because quite often those configuration settings just don't make sense. So I do a lot of work with the people in the government agencies, so they let me know. The other thing I do is actually talk to the agencies themselves, and so a lot of the work around compliance is saying to them, what do you really struggle with around compliance? Like, if we think about the NZISM as a whole, are there areas in there when you think about public cloud that just don't make sense? And then we feed that back to the team that write the NZISM and say, look, I'm hearing this across the agencies. Here's some feedback for you guys. So it's a real two-way street. I'm not saying that every change I suggest gets implemented, because there are sometimes good reasons those things are in there.
Yep.
And just because it's hard doesn't make it wrong. But it's important to get that feedback. Again, it's that feedback loop of making sure that if you're dictating the way that people should operate their environment, then you should be able to take feedback from those people and say, okay, maybe we need to rethink this, or this isn't in any way, shape or form feasible to implement. We've asked them to do this thing, but it's actually quite complex and costly, so the actual benefit we get is not applicable, or it's not comparable to the risk that we're trying to ameliorate. So there is that two-way street. So there's a lot of two-way sort of talking that we do, and so that sort of forms a lot of the way that we think about the controls and the policies that will get fed into those controls. So
it's a lot of responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Dictating that this is what secure looks like. Like you said, organizations are consuming this for good reason, right? It's there to help people from doing bad things, but it comes with additional complexity, additional cost in some examples. So having that feedback loop helps.
I think that's actually a really interesting point, because one of the things that comments I've heard in the past were, well, I've applied the NZISM initiative, I should be fine. And it's like, it's one part of a very big security puzzle. Compliance is a really hard thing to work on. Like, if compliance is your job, it fills your day, because you're forever measuring a moving target and a changing target. And so compliance is something that starts fresh every single week or every single month, right? So that's really difficult in itself. And then adding that sort of layer of, people like me doing interpretations of policy and then agreeing with or getting consensus from an agency about what those actually look like. So I mean, I don't make the decisions myself because that's not my job. It's the people who author the NZISM to say this is in or this is out. So I certainly I don't want to be the guy who's telling everybody how to run their Azure environment.
Yeah.
But that compliance standard is only one yardstick, right? And then you've got other ones like you mentioned before about PCI, DSS, and the NIST framework and the CIS benchmark. Those are other compliance standards that you might also have. But then you've got other guardrails and controls that you might have in place to prevent, to make sure that you're up to date and you're secure as you possibly can be. And all these things are moving all the time. So it's really complex and it's very difficult. So, hats off to a lot of the people who work in those security teams around our agencies. They've got a big task.
I just want to make sure it's clear for the listeners as well that, like, when we're talking about these compliance standards like the NZISM, it's not Azure Pacific. Like, it's a industry-wide thing that impacts other clouds, and whether it's on premises or it's running on AWS or running on GCP, Google Cloud Platform. Bevan just helps with the Azure perspective.
Luckily, it's a narrow focus, and it is, and that's the hard part of the NCSC's job is to think not just about Bevan's got a whiz-bang set of policies we can use to tick off an Azure environment. They have to consider all the other tech as well, so they've got a wider remit than what I deal with. So and so again, the controls that they think about and that they put into the NZISM have to be generic enough to be interpreted by those public cloud, on-prem and private cloud sort of style environments. So it's tough to come up with a list of controls that fit all of those environments.
So going back to Azure policies, initiatives, and definitions, are there any tips that you have for people who want to do what you do and put together initiatives or author their own Azure policies or keep them up to date?
Yeah, they become a bit of a labour of love. So iterate frequently and always second guess yourself. A lot of the times, if you're starting out with an initiative, you've got to have a really firm idea of what it is that you're trying to do. So what is the outcome that this initiative is going to actually give us as an organisation, and what environments does this apply to? So those sort of the guardrails for you to apply these initiatives to, because in Azure you can apply them at different layers, which will have different effects on the different resources that live underneath those different layers. So you've got to be really clear about your scope. And so the intent is the other thing that I described. So making sure you understand the outcome that you want. And so when we talk about Azure best practice and in our well-architected framework, in our cloud adoption framework, we talk specifically about guardrails as a function of ensuring that you create a series of policies and configuration settings that prevent users from perhaps overstepping their bounds, either unintentionally or maliciously. And so those guardrail policies are really, that's where a lot of agencies start, is building out a simple set of guardrails. Don't deploy large-scale VMs without approval. Don't deploy stuff in regions that we don't have approval to deploy in. Those are the sorts of things. So the intent around that one is to protect the agency from overspend and regulatory non-compliance. So those are the sorts of things you need to think about when you're building these initiatives. Like, what am I actually trying to do here? Other ones that I see that come through a lot are tagging policies. Again, building on what the CAF says, the Cloud Adoption Framework. Tagging policies about making sure that all your resources are tagged appropriately. So those are the intent of that policy initiative. It might have a whole bunch of policies that are built in, plus a few custom ones to tag things in a very specific way. But the intent of that is to give you a better understanding of your estate. I want to understand what everything is, who the service owners are, what cost centres they're attributed to, all of those sorts of things. So intent's really clear on those. So yeah, those are probably the two main things I would call out.
I like that, because for me personally, I could go off on a tangent, right? I could create an initiative that starts with tagging, and next minute I'm adding in all sorts of other things about like VM SKUs guys, or other things like that. So yeah, I think intent and what you're wanting to achieve is quite massive with that.
And keep it simple as well. Like, there is a tendency to just basically do a select all and dump it into an initiative. It's like, oh, well, all these policy settings must be right. And it's like, well, no, they're not. They are ways to configure certain things, and a lot of them have parameters. And so you might end up defining a hell of a lot of parameters, right? And there's a lot of nuance around building initiatives and using initiative parameters to give the same setting consistently across all of the policies that you're building out. This is getting into a bit of technical detail here, but it's that concept of doing stuff like that is like parameterization in code, right? Is you want to make sure that if you update it once, it updates it everywhere. And so, because you might have like 7 or 8 policies in an initiative that are using a very specific, like I said before, like a cipher key size, and they might apply to very different services. And say your recommendation changes and we want to up the strength and go to a 2048, or 3192 or whatever. Changing that once is far easier than changing it 8 times and making sure you got them all. So those sorts of things, parameterization of code and stuff like that starts getting important. The other one would be into the MS Defender stuff as well. Start thinking about how the people are going to actually use this. So if we think about guardrail policies are very enforcement or configuration. When you think about compliance, which is what we sort of have been focusing on, a lot of that information is surfaced through dashboards. So if you're writing your own compliance initiative, then you want to think about how you surface that information into the Defender portal, for instance. And so then you have to start thinking about populating group names, which is essentially the controls, and how they get read into the Defender dashboard. So this is part of what I do, is how does this render, and how much information do I need to put in there, and what makes sense to someone who's reading it. Like, if I read something that just says this relates to control C1434 on the NZISM, what does that mean? What the hell does that mean? I'd rather see it say the actual control and then perhaps a URL to the link. That's far more useful to me as someone who works on compliance. So that's another sort of lens when you get past the initial stuff, is start thinking about how people consume the information that you're putting in there.
I think that's good. Scope's another one, right? I've seen you touched on it before. You can deploy initiative or an Azure policy to a management group, a subscription, but depending on what you've got where, you may end up with a whole lot of exemptions, and your policy design gets messy really, really quickly. So being able to scope what you've got with the right intent, right, is key as well.
What I find useful is putting the intent in the policy description, making sure you're really clear about what this policy initiative is for, so that anyone who comes in, looks at this in the code, can see very clearly what you're trying to achieve with this. Again, there's horses for courses on that one about how specific you want to get, because there is a trade-off there as well. Otherwise, you end up with 15 different initiatives with 6 policies in each, rather than a few to manage.
Yeah, I'm sure. Like, there's AI systems that can help you generate your descriptions and things like that on the intent of the policy.
Yep. Yeah. The Copilot is really, really good for doing that, and I'd be lying if I said I haven't heavily leaned on that to do a lot of my heavy lifting when it comes to producing or taking data that I've got in CSV files and turning that into JSON. So I work in a lot of spreadsheets to sort of try and align policies to controls, and then you have to get that information into JSON form so that it can be consumed by the policy engine to create initiatives. And it's that gap that I've automated. So I actually don't do a lot of work there. It does a lot of work for me.
Nice. Okay. In the interest of time, it's been a pleasure talking to you, getting some of your knowledge, sharing with the community. Is there anything else you want to leave any listeners with who might be interested in policy or regulatory compliance before we end here?
Look, I'm available on LinkedIn and at Microsoft. If regulatory compliance and you are working in an agency today is something that you're concerned about, especially in the Microsoft space, just feel free to reach out to me. It doesn't always have to be about Azure either. Any of our Microsoft products, I do a lot of work across a bunch of different aspects of regulatory compliance, especially about producing guidance for agencies who have to do risk assessments. So there's a bunch of documents which we've recently republished around how you fill out the risk assessment tool for DIA. That is a mandatory requirement for agencies. If you've got questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help wherever I can.
Well, thank you, Bevan, and thank you for the work that you're doing to help organisations in New Zealand. So, thank you.